Britain and France have one of the world's oldest and proudest rivalries. They're friends now, but it took centuries of conflict before they got there. But what if Britain and France weren't rival countries, but the same country? For a few chaotic days in 1940, that's exactly what the British and French governments tried to make happen. In this video, we'll see just how close Britain and France came to joining together in what would have been one of the world's most unlikely but powerful unions. After Napoleon's defeat in 1815, relations gradually improved. By 1904, the Entente Cordiale settled outstanding issues between the countries, and with the First World War, they became stalwart allies. This remained true after Versailles and got more true with Germany's reawakening in the 1930s. As war loomed, the idea of an Anglo-French union first popped up. There were a few calls for it as early as 1938 as a way to deter Germany. After the war broke out, these calls became more common, and the countries did take some steps for closer cooperation. They formed a Supreme War Council to coordinate strategy in September 1939, followed by a Council to direct economic cooperation in 1940. By March, the two countries were in talks to coordinate their vast colonial empires to help each other's war efforts. The idea of a true union was still a novel idea, and one that was seen only as a peacetime solution. As late as February 28, 1940, the British Foreign Office was playing with the plan as a post-war project. In a memo, Sir Orma Sargent floated a union as a way for Britain and France to act as a combined counterweight to Germany. The British would have to give up some sovereignty to this new union, but the Foreign Office was confident that they had a few years to educate or use propaganda on the British public to make them accept the idea. It was a given that such plans were for after the war. As a sign of their shared commitment to end the war together, both nations agreed on March 28, 1940 that neither one would seek peace with Germany alone. There would be a united front until the end. Like most plans, it did not survive contact with the enemy. German troops burst over the French border on May 10, 1940. The French army crumbled, unprepared for the speed, scale, and sophistication of the German advance. Within weeks, the writing was on the wall. On June 11th, with the Germans bearing down on Paris, the French cabinet, headed by Prime Minister Paul Reynaud, informs the British that France's armies were exhausted and they didn't have reserves ready to turn things around. Churchill urged them to dig in at Paris, but Marshal Philippe Pétain, head of the French armed forces, replied that turning Paris into a ruin wouldn't change anything. Already, the prospect of an armistice was being talked about. General Maxime Weygand, a close ally of Pétain, had demanded Reynaud open negotiations. Pétain was clearly sympathetic to the idea. Meanwhile, Reynaud refused to consider it. He still believed France should uphold the promise made back in March not to seek an independent peace with the Germans. Reynaud explains this to Churchill, who told him that no matter what the French did, the British would keep fighting. This was a bit confusing for Reynaud. Was it just a general statement of resolve? Or was Churchill saying that France could surrender and Britain would fight on alone? Either way, Churchill suggested that they wait to hear from President Roosevelt about potential support before deciding anything. But as they waited, Germany cut deeper into France. Defeat looked inevitable, victory impossible. The pro-armistice faction was growing around Pétain, and with the French government retreating to Bordeaux on June 13th and German troops entering Paris the next day, it's easy to see why. The only hope anyone could see was an American intervention. Reynaud pleaded with Roosevelt, but when Roosevelt wrote to him on June 15th with no promise of American intervention, even Reynaud lost hope. He wrote to Churchill that evening, asking if the British would accept the French seeking a separate peace. At the time, London had four key concerns. 1. Keeping France in the fight. 2. Keeping French resources and assets at play to continue the war, especially the fleet. 3. Getting the US involved. And 4. Denying Germany any opportunity to invade Britain. Objective 1 seems like a lost cause, so Churchill sent telegrams back to Renault telling him that Britain would accept France seeking an armistice, but only if it got its fleet safely to British ports before the Germans got it, in keeping with objectives 2 and 4. Better the British have the French fleet than the Germans. But then another idea was suggested. If Britain could take control of France's fleets, why not everything else? It didn't have to be control, it could be cooperation. Merge the war cabinets, unite the parliaments, pool economic resources, and create what Secretary of State for India Leo Amery called a dramatic and spectacular expression of unity in action. Amery argued that such a union wouldn't just inspire the French troops, but it would convince the Americans that this was a winnable fight and get them involved too. It would help achieve all 4 of Britain's main strategic objectives. Churchill was surprised by the whole idea, and he was even more surprised to see his cabinet taking it seriously. But things were desperate. All of this was encouraged by the arrival of General Charles de Gaulle in London that morning. Fresh from the fall of Paris, de Gaulle had come to Britain with an iron resolve to keep France fighting from exile if he had to. If de Gaulle was willing to work so closely with Britain and help keep a French government in exile fighting, this Union plan might not be so absurd after all. Back in France, Renault had Britain's earlier reply of allowing an armistice on the condition of giving them the fleet. Secretly, Renault had hopes the British would say no and give him an excuse to ignore Pétain's faction to keep France in the fight. He was distraught until de Gaulle called him with news of this new Union plan. It was a godsend for Renault, but time was running out. It was a question of minutes, he said, when de Gaulle asked how long he had to work things out. "I give you half an hour." De Gaulle worked closely with Churchill's chief diplomatic advisor, Sir Robert Vansittart, to outline one of the most ambitious political unions ever devised with no time to spare. A plan was on Churchill's desk that afternoon. The proposal described a total union of defense, foreign, and financial policy, shared citizenship, mutual responsibility for post-war repairs, a united war cabinet, and associated parliaments. At this most fateful moment in the history of the modern world, the governments of the United Kingdom and the French Republic declare that France and Great Britain shall no longer be 2 nations, but one Franco-British Union. Within hours, Churchill's cabinet approved the proposal, and an abridged version was in Renault's hands to meet with his council of ministers. They were not impressed. France was on the verge of military defeat. Paris was in enemy hands. So when the Prime Minister appeared with an insane plan to unify with Britain, with no ideas of how to deal with the actual military crisis unfolding across the country, they were baffled. In truth, Maxime Weygand's spies had learned of the plan before the meeting. He thought it was ridiculous and had already turned several ministers against it before Renault even mentioned it. When Renault brought his proposal, those who weren't stunned in shock were already his enemies. Besides, pessimism and defeatism had taken over. The French leaders were convinced that Britain wouldn't last long either. Pétain dismissed it as a fusion with a corpse, while Weygand said Britain would have her neck wrung like a chicken in 3 weeks. The French cabinet brushed off the plan without even voting on it. Renault was crushed. It would be an armistice then. The meeting adjourned for a while, but when the ministers returned, they found that Renault had resigned his post, and thus the cabinet itself was dissolved. In less than an hour, Pétain organized a new government. and took just 10 minutes to agree to seek an armistice. The short-lived dream of the Anglo-French Union was over, and so was France's Third Republic. The Anglo-French Union seems absurd. Thrown together in a matter of hours, the plan was ambitious and transformative, with no real thought put into how it would actually be done. The French cabinet's reaction, after all they didn't even vote on it, would suggest it was too absurd to ever be a reality. However, later investigations and interviews with the members of Renault's cabinet reveal something fascinating. Had Renault put it to a vote, the plan might have actually won. Pétain and Weygand's factions, already primed to oppose the plan, came out swinging to condemn it, giving Renault the impression that most cabinet members opposed it. That's why he never bothered with a vote. In reality, most cabinet members needed time to think. We'll never know what would have happened had Renault forced a vote instead of resigning. Would the Union have ever been implemented? Would it have outlasted the war? Who can say? What we can say is that for a few days in June 1940, Britain and France came shockingly close to setting aside their 1,000-year rivalry to join under the same flag.